Chloe Bennett stepped off the bus, her hands gripping the straps of her backpack tightly, gazing up at the massive main gate of Westfield High. The cool autumn breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass and the lingering warmth of asphalt from the fading summer. The schoolyard buzzed with the sound of students, laughing, chatting casually, but Chloe felt out of place amid the crowd. This was her fourth school transfer in 3 years, not because her parents switched jobs, but because she needed to erase her past once again. She lowered her head, walked through the gate, hoping to blend into the stream of people without anyone noticing. A few students turned their heads, curious about the new girl, but Chloe avoided their eyes. Westfield High wasn't anything special, a big suburban school in Seattle filled with middle-class kids who'd known each other since they were little. The football team was decent, the cheer squad was popular, and the social hierarchy had been locked in place long before she showed up. Chloe didn't care about any of that stuff. Her only goal was to become invisible. Inside, the hallway roared like a chaotic marketplace, lockers slamming shut, sneakers squeaking on tiled floors, teachers shouting to herd students into classrooms before the first bell rang. Chloe clutched her schedule tightly in her hand, moving forward, already too familiar with this drill, finding her locker, picking a lunch spot, and most importantly, figuring out who to steer clear of. Then she saw Gavin Reed. Tall, broad-shouldered, exuding the confidence of someone who owned the crowd. He leaned against a row of lockers, surrounded by a pack of guys in Letterman jackets, laughing loud at something he'd just said. From a distance, Chloe clocked his vibe, the kind of guy who made others either submit or tremble. Gavin was Westfield High's golden boy, star quarterback, good-looking, from a wealthy family, but there was more to it. The kids around him laughed too hard at his words, shifted their weight nervously when he glanced their way. Chloe knew this type well, thriving on power and intimidation, the kind she'd run into at schools before. She had no intention of catching his attention. But fate had other plans. As Chloe walked by, someone deliberately slammed hard into her shoulder. Her books spilled across the floor, scattering everywhere, and a few students turned to watch, snickering. She bent down to pick them up, her cheeks burning, trying to ignore the attention. "Well, well, who do we have here?" a voice rang out, calm but dripping with mockery. Chloe froze. She didn't need to look up to know it was Gavin Reed. His friend's laughter erupted behind him like a chorus of malice. She slowly raised her eyes. Gavin stood there, arms crossed, flashing that smug smirk she'd seen before on bullies who thought they ruled the school. "Fresh meat, huh?" he asked, his voice smooth as oil. "Haven't seen your face around here before." Chloe didn't answer, just gathered her books, stood up, and brushed past him without a word. But Gavin wasn't done. "Hey, where you rushing off to, kid?" he called after her, his voice echoing down the hall, pulling in more stares. "I'm talking to you. Don't you hear me?" Chloe kept walking, too seasoned for this game. The best way to deal with guys like him was to not get sucked in. But Gavin didn't take kindly to being ignored. She felt a sharp tug on her backpack from behind, not hard enough to hurt, but enough to pull her back, forcing her to stop. She turned slowly, facing him. The hallway went still. The crowd's eyes locked on them like they were watching a drama unfold. Chloe looked straight into Gavin's eyes, and for the first time she caught a flicker of curiosity in his gaze. Maybe even a hint of surprise that she didn't bow her head. "You just made a mistake," she said quietly, her voice even but icy. Gavin raised an eyebrow, letting out a slow, taunting laugh. "Oh yeah? I'm quaking over here." His buddies snickered along. Chloe didn't reply, just held his stare, unblinking. Gavin tilted his head, that smirk still clinging to his lips. "You're pretty weird, you know that?" he said, his tone light but thick with mockery. Chloe turned away, kept walking, knowing full well he wasn't done with her. She'd played this game before. The only way out was to not give him what he wanted, a reaction. The day dragged on like a haze. She sat at the back of classrooms, answering only when called on, avoiding eye contact with anyone. At lunch, she found a tucked-away corner in the cafeteria, a spot where she could watch without being seen. Gavin and his crew took over the biggest table in the center, laughing and talking loud like they owned the whole damn place. Every now and then she felt his eyes flick toward her, but he didn't make a move. Not yet. By the end of the day, she breathed a sigh of relief as she finally escaped the school. The Seattle sun still blazed, the asphalt shimmering under her feet as she headed for the bus stop, just wanting to get home. "Hey, new girl!" A voice cut through the air right as her hand touched her phone. Chloe turned. Gavin stood there, hands stuffed in his pockets, that cocky grin plastered across his face. Behind him, a few of his buddies hung back, waiting like a pack of dogs on a leash. She sighed, not hiding her weariness. "What do you want, Gavin?" He stepped closer, slow and deliberate, like he was stretching out the moment. "You've got an attitude problem, you know that?" Chloe stayed quiet, not bothering to respond. Gavin's grin stretched wider, his eyes glinting with amusement. "Who do you think you are, acting all high and mighty?" She let out a short laugh, not out of fear, but because it was ridiculous, and that threw Gavin off for a split second. "I think you should turn around and go back," she said slowly, her eyes never leaving his. Gavin's grin faltered. Then he stepped in closer, towering over her by a full head, his shadow falling like he meant to crush her. "And if I don't want to, huh?" Chloe leaned in, her voice dropping to a sharp whisper. "Because you don't even know who I am." He burst out laughing, shaking his head like he'd just heard the lamest joke ever. "So, who are you, princess? Spill it." Chloe stepped back, pulled her phone from her pocket, and pressed a button. A deep, rumbling engine roared to life, loud and unmistakable. A sleek black Ford Mustang rolled up, stopping right at the curb, turning heads nearby. The tinted window slid down slowly, revealing Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson behind the wheel, his gaze calm but piercing. Gavin's grin vanished like someone had snatched it away. Chloe turned back to him, flashing a faint smile for the first time that day. "Still think I'm weird?" He didn't answer, feeling small for the first time in his life, swallowed by his own silence. Chloe watched Gavin stiffen, his jaw clenching, his eyes darting between her and Dwayne in obvious panic. The air grew heavy, his usual swagger shrinking into unease. He took half a step back, his buddies swapping nervous glances behind him, none daring to speak. Chloe casually adjusted her backpack straps, letting out a soft breath, like she'd just flipped the script on the school's so-called king without breaking a sweat. Dwayne hadn't said a word yet, just sat there, one hand on the wheel, his steady gaze pinned on Gavin, a look that could crush anyone without needing to open his mouth. Gavin swallowed hard, his voice cracking slightly. "Hold up," he muttered, like he was trying to convince himself this wasn't real. He looked at Chloe again, really looked, as if piecing together a puzzle that should have been obvious from the start. "Still think I'm just some nobody?" she asked, her voice firm, her stare daring him to answer. He opened his mouth, but no words came out, his lips moving uselessly. Then Dwayne spoke, his voice deep and no nonsense. "Get in, kid." Chloe didn't hesitate. She walked past Gavin, past the hushed crowd that had started to gather, opened the car door and climbed into the passenger seat. Dwayne shifted into gear, the Mustang letting out a guttural growl as it peeled away from the curb, leaving behind a wake of whispers and stunned stares from the students. Seattle's cityscape blurred past the windows, the late afternoon sun painting golden streaks across the dashboard. Chloe tapped her fingers lightly on her knee, easing the tension that had clung to her since morning. Dwayne glanced over, his voice low and even. "You okay?" She nodded, then let out a small, sheepish laugh. "Kinda over the top, huh?" Dwayne smirked, that signature half-smile creeping onto his face. "Just a little." She looked out the window, her gaze distant. "I didn't mean for them to find out like that." He shot her a look, teasing but serious. "What then, you gonna let that punk walk all over you?" Chloe leaned back in the seat, exhaling. "I wasn't gonna let him walk over me. I was just waiting for the right moment." Dwayne raised an eyebrow, curious. "Waiting for what?" She shrugged, her tone soft. "The perfect timing." He chuckled lightly, like it jogged a memory. "Sounds like me when I was your age." Chloe glanced at him, the corner of her mouth twitching into a smirk. That's a scary thought. Dwayne laughed out loud, shaking his head, his voice warm and deep. Smartass. They drove in comfortable silence, the tension melting away in the familiar rhythm of their banter. But Chloe knew it wasn't over. Gavin wasn't the type to let things go, and the fear she'd planted in him could easily turn into dangerous anger. When the car pulled up to their modern house tucked away in a quiet Seattle suburb, Chloe unbuckled her seatbelt, but didn't get out right away. Dwayne noticed her hesitation. Something up? She paused, then let out a breath. He's not done with me yet. Dwayne studied her for a long moment, his eyes steady but sharp, then nodded. He's not, but I'm not done with him either. She met his gaze, her voice tinged with uncertainty. You think I should fight back? He leaned back in his seat, resting his arm on the wheel. I think you need to be ready. Guys like him hate losing, and when they're scared, they get stupid. Chloe nodded, her eyes resolute. I know. The next morning, Westfield High was thick with whispers. Chloe walked through the halls, feeling hundreds of eyes on her. Rumors spread like wildfire. Yesterday, it was the girl picked up by Dwayne Johnson in a Mustang. Today, it was about Gavin plotting payback. She spotted him near the lockers, flanked by his jock buddies, their hostile stares cutting her way. Gavin didn't smile, just stared, his eyes narrowed like he was scheming. Chloe held his gaze half a second longer than necessary, then walked into class, ignoring the murmurs trailing behind her. At lunchtime, things escalated fast. Chloe carried her tray to an empty table when Ryan, a hulking guy from Gavin's crew, deliberately stuck out his foot to trip her. She stumbled, her tray clattering, but she kept her balance, not letting it drop. Gavin's buddies burst into laughter, like they'd just seen the best comedy skit ever. Chloe straightened up, adjusted her tray, and didn't react, making them even more pissed off. What, gone mute, princess? Ryan growled, smirking, stepping closer. Chloe exhaled sharply, her lips curling into a sneer, her voice icy. Didn't know fossils could still walk. The crowd around let out a collective, ooh, a few snickers breaking through. Ryan froze, his face flushing red. Gavin, watching from a distance, tilted his head, his eyes darkening like he was plotting his next move. Chloe didn't wait to see what he'd do. She walked past, sat down at her table, and started eating like nothing had happened, but she knew it wasn't over. At the end of the day, when she opened her locker, the sight wasn't unexpected. Books spilled across the floor, markers scrawled all over the door. Dumb, insulting scribbles. She sighed, leaned against the locker next to it, her gaze sweeping the hallway. A few students stood nearby, watching from afar, none daring to come closer, but all curious to see what she'd do. Chloe bent down, picked up each book, stacking them neatly. Her hands didn't shake, her expression didn't waver. She could feel Gavin standing not far off, watching, waiting for a reaction. Anger, tears, anything. She gave him nothing. She stood up, shut her locker, and walked away without looking back. That silence seemed to rattle him more than anything. That night, in her kitchen, Chloe sat tapping her fingers on the wooden table, the warm yellow light casting a glow on her face. Dwayne leaned against the counter, arms crossed, eyeing her with a probing look. Something happened today? She broke the quiet. Dwayne raised an eyebrow, his voice deep. They trashed your locker today, didn't they? She nodded, smirking faintly. Yeah, that's the most creative they've gotten so far. He nodded slowly, his eyes not leaving her. What's your plan? Chloe went quiet for a moment, then smiled, a mischievous glint flashing in her eyes. I'm gonna let him dig his own grave. Dwayne let out a big laugh, the sound filling the small room. That's my girl! Chloe got Gavin, a show-off who lived for the crowd's cheers, leaning on fear to dominate. She'd met guys like him before, loud, full of themselves, always needing an audience to prop up their cruelty. They thrived on reactions, fear, submission, the power they thought they held. But the truth was, guys like Gavin weren't as untouchable as they believed. They screwed up, and Chloe was patient. She'd let him push himself into a corner with no way out. The next morning, Chloe walked into Westfield High like nothing had happened. Whispers trailed her, but they'd shifted. Yesterday, it was about the girl Dwayne Johnson picked up in a Mustang. Today, it was about Gavin wrecking her locker. The school split. Some found it hilarious. Others thought Gavin was making a fool of himself. Chloe felt the change. When people started questioning the king's power, his kingdom started to wobble. Gavin leaned against the lockers as usual, his crew around him laughing about some joke, probably another nasty jab, but as Chloe passed by, the laughter cut off, a few eyes darting her way. She didn't stop. Didn't glance over, making Gavin's face tighten, his jaw clenching. At lunch, Gavin couldn't stand her silence anymore. He yelled across the cafeteria, his voice booming, "Hey, Bennett, still crying over that locker, kid?" The room went quiet, eyes bouncing between them. Chloe grabbed her tray, walked past him like she didn't hear a thing, but Gavin wasn't letting it go. "Guess you need your badass dad to fight your battles, huh?" he roared, his tone pure provocation. A few scattered laughs came from his buddies. Chloe stopped, turned, and locked eyes with him. "Funny thing," she said, her voice calm but cutting. "You keep dragging my dad into this. But you're the one who nearly pissed himself when he showed up." The cafeteria went dead silent. Gavin's face darkened, his friends shifting awkwardly, unsure whether to laugh or shut up. Chloe sat down, kept eating, her eyes never leaving him, wanting him to soak in that humiliation, let it eat away at his confidence. He clenched his jaw, forced a laugh, trying to claw back control. "You think you're hot shit, huh? Strutting around with your fancy dad and slick car?" His voice carried loud, pulling the room's focus. "You think you're better than us, Bennett?" Chloe tilted her head, her gaze steady but sharp. "No, I just don't need to prove anything." That difference drove him nuts. She saw him make up his mind, his body tensing, his hand balling into a fist for a split second before relaxing. He wasn't done, and she was ready for his next play. After school, Chloe walked slowly to the parking lot, knowing full well Gavin was waiting. He leaned against his car, alone this time, no posse around him. His face was cold, the usual smug grin gone. She stopped a few feet away, raising an eyebrow. "Let me guess," she said, her voice even but laced with sarcasm. "Another big speech about how I don't belong here?" Gavin snorted hard through his nose, his eyes glued to her. "No, I just want to ask one thing." "Go ahead," she replied, crossing her arms. He stared at her for a long moment, his voice losing its mocking edge, dropping low, almost genuinely curious. "Why don't you push back?" Chloe thought for a second, then shrugged. "Because I don't need to." He scoffed, but it lacked the old confidence. "That's not how it works, Bennett. Guys like me push, and people like you either push back or get crushed." She stepped closer, lowering her voice, her eyes locking onto his. "Or people like me wait. Let guys like you keep pushing, keep screwing up, keep showing how weak you really are. Then, when you're standing in the mess you made, I don't have to do a thing. You've already wrecked yourself." Gavin stared, a flicker of doubt in his eyes, but he masked it fast with a forced smirk. "You think you've got me figured out? You don't know a damn thing about me." Chloe studied him, her voice flat. "Maybe not, but I know you're scared." He stiffened, his shoulders tensing. "I'm not scared of you." She gave a cold smile, no warmth in it. "Not of me. You're scared of being irrelevant, of losing everything, of waking up one day and realizing nobody gives a shit unless you're stepping on someone else. That's what really scares you, Gavin." His jaw tightened, nostrils flaring, his eyes flashing with suppressed rage, but he didn't argue back. Deep down, he knew she was right. Chloe shook her head slightly. "I don't need to fight you, Gavin. You're already fighting yourself." She turned and walked off, leaving him there, speechless for the first time since she'd met him. That night, Chloe sat at the kitchen table, swirling the ice in her glass, the clinking sound echoing in the quiet space. Dwayne leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching her with a searching look. "Something go down today?" She broke the silence. He raised an eyebrow, his voice low. "Gavin messed with you again today, didn't he?" She nodded, her lips twitching into a smirk. "Yeah, I think I got under his skin." Dwayne chuckled softly, a spark of pride in his eyes. Good, she exhaled, staring down at her glass. But he's not done yet. He stepped over, sat across from her, leaning forward. You want to be done? She frowned, puzzled. What do you mean? He looked her square in the eye. You could end it right now. Call him out, humiliate him in front of the whole school. You're tougher than you think, kid. Chloe went quiet for a long stretch, her fingers stopping their tapping on the table. Then she shook her head. No. I want him to end himself. Dwayne laughed loud, the sound bouncing around the room. Smart as hell. She leaned back in her chair, stretching her arms overhead, her voice soft. Yeah, but it's going to take patience. He nodded, his eyes gleaming. Lucky for you, you've got plenty of that. Chloe smirked, a confident grin spreading. Yeah, I do. Chloe knew this game was nearing its end. Gavin had pushed and pushed, waiting for her to break, but he was the one unraveling. She saw it in how his eyes darted around when she walked into a room, how he got edgier every time someone mentioned her name, how his buddies didn't laugh as easily at his jabs anymore. He'd always been the one in control, the one with all the power, but now he was scrambling to hold on to something slipping through his fingers. 2 days later, the school exploded with buzz before Chloe even stepped through the gate. She walked past the front doors, instantly catching the hushed whispers, the stifled giggles, the way kids clustered together, glancing toward the lockers. Something had happened, and she had a gut feeling she knew what it was. She made her way to the crowd gathered near Gavin's locker. Students stood there, some snapping pics with their phones, others murmuring in disbelief. Plastered across his locker door was a collage of printed screenshots, texts, comments, private chats. Every cruel, degrading thing Gavin had ever said behind people's backs was laid bare. Mocking friends he'd faked loyalty to, trashing teachers, racist and sexist remarks that couldn't be brushed off as jokes. Worst of all, the timestamps showed they weren't old, they were fresh, recent. Gavin shoved through the crowd, his face pale, eyes wide as he saw the display on his locker. "What the hell is this?" he roared, his voice sharp, hands trembling as he tore the papers down. But it was too late. Everyone had seen it. Chloe leaned against the locker across from his, arms crossed, silently watching his reputation crumble right in front of her. The kids who'd once laughed at his jokes now stared at him with disgust. His tight-knit crew backed off, putting distance between them, unwilling to sink with him. Gavin spun around, his eyes locking onto hers, blazing with unfiltered fury. "You did this," he hissed, his voice low and shaking with barely contained rage. Chloe tilted her head, her tone calm. "Did I?" He snarled, stepping closer. "You think you're so smart, huh? Think this makes you better than me?" She stepped forward, her voice steady and unshaken. "No, Gavin. It just shows who you are. Now everyone else sees it too." His fists clenched, his whole body quivering with anger, his eyes flaring like he might snap. For a split second she thought he might lose it, might swing at her right there in the middle of the hall. But he didn't. He couldn't, because doing it would only prove her right. Instead, he turned on his heel and stormed off, shoving through the crowd like a wounded animal. Chloe knew he couldn't outrun this. His kingdom had fallen, no chance of rebuilding it. That afternoon, as Chloe walked out of school, Dwayne was leaning against the Mustang, waiting for her like always. He wore a plain tee, his expression calm, but with a hint of pride lurking in his eyes. She climbed into the passenger seat, letting out a soft sigh of relief. He didn't start the engine right away, just looked at her. "All done, huh?" She nodded, her voice quiet. "All done." He smirked, a small grin tugging at his lips. "Didn't even have to throw a punch, did you?" She leaned back in the seat, smiling tiredly but satisfied. "Didn't need to." Dwayne turned the key, the Mustang's engine roaring to life, and they pulled away from the school. Chloe thought about everything. The past few weeks. Everything that led to this moment. How she'd changed, not just with Gavin, but with herself. Dwayne glanced over. "What now?" She smiled faintly, her eyes lighting up. "Now I finally get to enjoy high school." He laughed hard, the sound ringing through the car. That's my girl. As the Mustang sped down Seattle's suburban roads, the weight that had pressed on Chloe's chest for so long finally lifted. She'd won. Not by yelling louder, hitting harder, or being meaner, but by being smart, patient, letting the truth do all the work. As for Gavin Reed, he was just a cautionary tale now. Proof that power built on fear never lasts, and sometimes the quiet ones are the ones you should fear most.